Hello and welcome to today's event. I'm Dr. Christopher Porter. I'll be speaking on Google's perspective on artificial intelligence. A big part of that is identity security, and ultimately what I want to talk to you about is who's going to benefit more, the bad guys or the good guys? What's the offense-defense balance medium term going to look like in cyberspace as we deploy Agentic AI on the APT side and on the provider side? So I'll speak to you just very briefly about conceptually what is AI good for if you're on offense. And the way any enterprise tends to think about artificial intelligence, you take your existing workflow and you bring in some generative AI and some chatbots, and it somehow makes things better. But more professional organizations that have put more thought into the transition, actually redesign their workflows around which parts are doable with AI and which parts require a human being. Okay, that's not the topic of today's lecture, but I do want to talk about intrinsically if your enterprise is a cyber criminal enterprise and your business is committing cyber crimes or engaging in espionage if you're a nation state and you redesign your workflow around AI, what is it that you tell your boss you're doing? Why are you spending these resources? Notwithstanding that there's lots of made for the movies kind of scenarios that everyone is looking for. Can AI discover a 0 day? Can it automate offense? I'm not saying that that's not going to happen and that there's a little bit of a hint that it is useful for conducting offensive operations, as we will discuss. But the thing that AI is actually good for in terms of getting results for your criminal enterprise today is mostly translation. And I don't just mean translation between languages, although that's important. I also mean translation in the sense of directly and believably impersonating a particular person. So if I want to go after your organization and I've successfully spearphished one of your employees, but he doesn't have the access that I want. What I really want is his boss and her access. It's not enough to just speak English. I have to sound like him, and I have to reference real world events that he would reference in an email and speak with his idioms. Your colleagues are going to tell if the email coming from them looks weird. So this is a problem that, a human being can solve. If you're an operator, you can get someone's mailbox and read through thousands of emails and, construct something like, hey, sorry, I have to go home early again today. My kid is sick again. Can you click on this link for me real quick? But, a generative AI can do that in the twinkling of an eye instead of, days or weeks of preparation. You can move very quickly laterally. I used to give this slide and it was a theoretical. It was a prediction. I haven't had to update the slide because unfortunately it's been proven correct. I mean, this is what a lot of APT groups and advanced cybercriminal groups do. They do some initial reconnaissance, of course, and we'll talk about that in the next few slides, but moving laterally, translation, extremely important. Even translating between languages changes the threat landscape in ways you might not fully appreciate. So for example, there are some regional cyber powers, particularly in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, to a lesser extent Southeast Asia or the Gulf countries, where they're very technically skilled, but maybe they don't speak world languages. They only speak Spanish or their dialect of Arabic or Vietnamese or whatever. They don't speak the target language that they want to go after. And that's not a barrier anymore. Those are not going to be just regional threats. They're going to be global threats. So the implication for you is everybody has APT groups that you commonly track that are, you want to stop anyone from getting into your network, but we all have groups that we know that target us again and again or target our industry again and again. And maybe you devote extra time to tracking those and thinking about them in depth. That list is going to broaden over time. These groups are going to sort of escape from being in their region. Also, if you have a footprint in certain international places where the local environment, has a language that isn't widely spoken outside of the home country, Japan is a classic example. To me, big, huge economy, technologically advanced. Yes, there are Japanese speakers in East Asia and in other countries as well, but it's not a commonly spoken first language outside of the region and maybe certain parts of Latin America and Southeast East Asia. But most of the rest of the world, you're not going to naturally generate that. So a lot of offensive APT programs who might want to hack targets in Japan, they may have the technical skill and the means, and but do they have someone on staff who's both technical and a native Japanese speaker? Probably not. So they're somewhat insulated in that sense, but that's not true anymore. So yeah, translation, for AIs and chatbots, just keep in mind it means moving laterally better, but it also means changing the APT groups you're exposed to, or depending on your international footprint, how your overseas offices might be exposed. But don't take my word for it. Nothing beats having a good market study. These are all the leading criminal LLMs that cyber criminals sell to one another. So they take You could imagine they could take Llama or something like that, take some open source model or a Chinese model, a Quinn or something, take it and post-train it to accept criminal inquiries. Obviously, the major frontier models, including Gemini and ChatGPT and Claude and all those, have extensive efforts to prevent people from asking explicitly criminal queries of their LLMs. This is the opposite. They have taken open source models typically and trained them specifically to do crime, and then they're selling them to one another. This is business to business from the major LLM developers for cyber criminals. If you notice, they're almost all offering phishing. The other stuff that they're almost all doing is tech support and code generation. So we're not talking, again, about writing truly new malware or discovering a 0 day or something like that would be really sort of an exciting conference paper or something like that. I'm sure that's coming, but that is not the state of the market today. This is the routine software maintenance, just like any enterprise does, only they're maintaining criminal software, right? And perhaps repackaging it so if there's been a signature developed, they can sort of complicate signature detection. That's probably about the most offensive use you'll see. Vulnerability exploitation. This is similar to Metasploit. They're just saying, hey, here's the part of the network I can see. These are the devices I can see and the software I can see. Are there any exploits here? It doesn't really add a new capability qualitatively. It's, you could look this up manually or use Metasploit or something, but it does sort of ensure that you don't miss anything, right? It's checking all the repositories for vulnerabilities. So if you're on offense, it's an easy one-stop shop for all your vulnerabilities. This is a particular financially motivated, probably cybercrime group that we have tracked, and we could see some of their posts that they were making, that they were prompting their LLM. They're asking for tech support. It looks pretty benign. It's not intrinsically malicious, but they're asking for tech support for their offensive software or to sort of obfuscate the purpose, but they're trying to figure out why something they're doing to this target isn't working and asking the LLM for technical help. The criminals also use AI to run tech support. Again, if your mental model is cyber criminals are someone in their parents' basement and they somehow meet together to commit crime. That is true at the edges, but the big groups, the ones that bedevil enterprises, overwhelmingly the vast majority of ransomware and other sort of large-scale crimes are committed by a relatively small number of groups that are fairly big and sophisticated. They're going to function like enterprises where they in this case, they're buying access to malware GPT, they're buying access to a criminal LLM, and no one would do that if it didn't work, right? They wouldn't have a subscription or buy access if it didn't work. So the purveyors have to, provide tech support. Everyone has a hard time maintaining enough technical personnel, but if you're a criminal organization, hiring a new programmer, coder, hacker also carries with it the risk of penetration by law enforcement. You have to establish the bona fides for the person and make sure they're not there to destroy your criminal enterprise, more so than is true in normal private business. So there's a high opportunity cost for those people. They don't want to take their hackers off of doing frontline on-keyboard work, which is how they make their money. They don't want to take them off that to provide tech support on something else. So in this case, these are developers of an LLM. They don't want their developers spending their time doing tech support. They want them developing this malware-enabling GPT. So they try to use AI to do it. Now let's talk about not just conceptually what is it good for, but this is theoretical, not live in the wild, but this was still it's pretty good real-world simulation that DeepMind did, Google DeepMind. These are the folks at Google who run our Frontier Lab. They've won 3 Nobel Prizes in the past 2 years. I'm not an AI researcher. I'm a user, essentially, or I research how bad guys use AI and attack AI, but I'm not an AI scientist myself. These people are. I assume if they've gotten 3 Nobel Prizes in 2 years, they're pretty good at their job. So I just sort of assume this is also high-quality research. We provided them with all of the threat data that Google Threat Intelligence, which is the team that defends Google itself, but also Mandiant, which does incident response all over the world, all the operations we had ever seen broken down by phase. And they tried to train an LLM to reproduce this autonomously. Could we train one of these thinking machines to be a world-class hacker? Darker squares are more autonomous. Lighter squares are the autonomy was more likely to fail or need human intervention or it just didn't succeed. My interpretation of this is that clearly defined offensive tasks, SQL injection being a great one because it's pretty highly scriptable. The more defined the task, LLMs today could automate that. And you've probably seen Anthropic put out a paper recently also on what they say was a Chinese origin AI campaign. I think they have similar results that are worth reading. So across all techniques, AI also very useful for reconnaissance. This isn't necessarily going to trip safety alarms because it could be, frankly, the same kinds of questions that an investor would ask. Tell me about this target company and any recent news and who the key executives are and what their global footprint is. And, it's that kind of research that you might call due diligence, but they're not doing due diligence looking for problems and hoping to make an investment. They're looking for due diligence, trying to find problems to exploit, right? But the queries look the same. So first phase reconnaissance, going on social media and crawling and building profiles on people, read this person's X posts since time immemorial and tell me what kind of person they are and what interests they have. AI is incredible for that. I mean, it really is going to be powerful and it's going to reduce a lot of time. When you get to areas of an operation that require more discretion, for example, don't just break in, but break in and steal something, or break in and steal something and get it out, or break in and steal something and exfiltrate it without getting caught. That increasingly requires both sophisticated multi-step planning, which is a technical barrier, but I think if you read the Anthropic paper, you'll see that they're starting to make progress on that. But even if you have that, to do it without getting caught really is a theory of mind question. Do you understand the cat and mouse game and what the defenders might be doing and what you can see and what you can't see? We didn't really see a lot of evidence that AI could handle that on its own. Even if it had the thinking power, it just wasn't successful at it. Now, that's theoretical, but kind of simulates the real world. What is actually happening in the real world? We did a study on known APT groups who were using Gemini, our AI model. None of them, I mean, our safety measures, prevented them from doing anything operational. We didn't find anything novel or unique anyway, but we did know when some of these groups were accessing the model. So what did they use it for? Iranian government APT groups were our biggest users. Nearly a third of all the activity from nation states was from Iran. They're doing public research, crafting spear phishing campaigns. This is another one of those groups that I'm talking about. They're a regional power in the Middle East, very sophisticated in terms of their cyber knowledge. And they do obviously speak European languages and English and so forth, but with a higher opportunity cost than, say, a Russia, China, the U.S., others that have just a much bigger economy and security apparatus. There's more of a trade-off for Iran. So they are a real menace in the region, and maybe can go after targets in Europe and rarely in the U.S. very successfully, but they don't do a lot of it. This is really going to open up possibilities for them to be able to craft these phishing campaigns at scale in native English, correct accent, correct target, bona fides. Being able to do research into individuals also, saves a lot of time. A lot of people in Iran's programs, are university students essentially who are doing their militia duty serving in the military. So they may know the technical side, may not know the intelligence side. This is a big boon for them to help with reconnaissance. China, obviously, they're a leader in developing AI anyway, so what do they have to use Western AIs for? But we still see them, the military and the intelligence and security bureaus doing this. Over half of all hacking attempts that we see that are going towards Google users come from China. So we know China is a big source of cyber threat. Mostly they're using Western LLMs, including Gemini. They're asking technical questions and little fixes. It's just it's convenient. It's a convenient quick fix for a technical problem. I do want to highlight that China has the technical capability, but they haven't really done much in the real world going after industrial control systems, operational technology networks. They have cyber ranges where they can practice this stuff, but they haven't done it much in the real world. You start spinning up an AI and you can start simulating targets, right? Pretend that you are this model of Siemens, whatever equipment, and then you let your cyber range warriors go against it. So this is going to really enhance the ability for China and others to practice OT network attacks without having to actually blow anything up. They can simulate the behavior of the target, pretty well in a cyber range using AI. North Korea, I think we're all aware, they largely use this to get jobs, mostly just to generate revenue for the regime, but they also are able to do very sophisticated supply chain attacks. If you haven't noticed, they're basing these employees all over the world, targets all over the world. It used to just be Western Europe and the U.S. The police in those countries have gotten better about catching them and kicking them out, and they've had to diversify. That could be supply chain operations, not just against the target where they've gotten a job. It could be using the creds of a developer to go after open source software. Very sophisticated ability to plan for this. I don't want to short sell you. We have seen some malware that itself uses AI. Prompt Flux uses the Gemini AI, or used before we shut it down, the Gemini AI to modify itself just before the dropper was delivered. Again, that doesn't give it a new capability. It's just an evasion technique. Basically rewrite me, do the same thing, but rewrite the non-malicious parts of my code in a different way so that it has a different signature every time. The Russian military has done something similar using an open source Chinese model, Quinn. Same thing. Before I go and, in this case, they're doing espionage, before I grab these documents, rewrite, or write some of the script that we need for theft live on the fly. So it's even if you catch them, it's harder to detect each time because the code is slightly different each time. And just briefly, I'll wrap up with some good news. I'm kind of a bad news expert. I'm an analyst. It's not really my job to give good news, but I am actually a little bit of an optimist on AI for defenders. By taking some of our intelligence that we had, we knew that there was a criminal group that had a 0 day in this SSL package. We were able to use our AI to find that 0 day. So a little bit of cheating. We knew that it was there to be found, but we didn't know what it was, and we were able to find it before the group was able to launch the attack. They didn't exploit anyone because we got it patched beforehand. On the development side, we use Gemini to fix 15% of the bugs we find in our own software. So, that's a huge boon even for us with as many engineers as Google has. I think these are kind of illustrative real-world examples of the kind of ROI you could expect in your organization, right? This isn't getting 500 times, your normal output or some huge qualitative gain. That may come later. But right now today, a 15% improvement, very reasonable. For our incident responders internal to Google, 51% in their use of time, meaning they're able to cover 51% more trouble tickets in internal investigations than they were before we introduced Gemini. That's a huge gain. And that almost entirely comes from having Gemini write the first draft of their incident report. So it's not necessarily doing the technical work, it's when they bring their forensic evidence back and have to write up a textual report for their boss. Some people are good at that, some people aren't. This cuts out, hours or sometimes a day or more of their time. That's extra time they can spend investigating cases. At large scale, we use AI to improve our ability to fuzz not only our own open source software packages, but for fuzzer coverage of third-party open source software that our customers rely on in GCP. We do this because the AI is able to predict what kinds of fuzzing inputs might be more relevant. Essentially, it helps generate more relevant prompts for the fuzzer. When I came in from the government, it was impressive to me that we were able to produce malware analysis reports sort of around the clock, that we constantly work. Instead of just 9 to 5, we constantly work. We've now, in some cases, cut that down to 27 seconds. If it's straightforward malware, we can dump that in. Even someone like me who has an intelligence background, not a malware reverse engineering background, if you find something in an interesting case, you can do that. If it finds that it's not anything too interesting, that's fine. If it's interesting, of course, you can always have a human review it, but that really helps with the triage. And probably my favorite example, I'll close on this. You could imagine that there are hacktivist groups all the time that claim access to industrial control systems, usually water systems. We've hacked this and we're going to do XYZ thing. Well, to analyze that, you really need multiple different kinds of expertise. You need someone who's technically knowledgeable about cyber operations. You need someone who knows the kind of operations in the industry that's claiming to be effective. You might also need someone who's an expert in that particular group, and you might need someone who speaks the language, and that's usually not all the same person. So you need 3 or 4 different high-level experts to analyze this. The Gemini model can very quickly look at a screenshot, tell you what it is, what the system is, what somebody who has access to it can and cannot do. So they might really have access, but be exaggerating the damage they can cause. They might have very routine access that doesn't lets them see the operations, but not control them, for example. So it'll tell you that right away. Obviously, language is no barrier, so we don't have to, in this case, get someone who speaks Polish. It just translates it for me. But it also pulls from our intelligence holdings. The group that is posting this, are they a group that usually tells the truth, or do they make a lot of exaggerated claims? Again, I wouldn't necessarily make a final decision based on this kind of a report, but when this stuff drops after office hours and you're trying to decide, do we need to call people in for emergency overtime work, this can really help with triaging. If it is an issue, like they really do appear to have serious access and it's from a group that isn't known for bluster, it also gives you a head start. You already know what they have access to. You already know what they're claiming and they're saying. You can give the actual experts immediately while they're driving into work or dialing in remotely. You can tell them, here's what you're coming into. So worst case scenario, it really speeds up an actual investigation. Best case scenario, you can leave it for them to start the next morning. They don't necessarily have to come in if it's very likely to not be anything malicious. So a little bit of good news, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. You can imagine reducing language barriers, moving faster. If you're on offense, that's something that'll happen or is happening now. On defense, the ability to maybe not be as good as the best human defenders, but be 80, 90% as good, but never sleep, be able to deploy instantly all the time, very quickly handling some of the grunt work of writing reports. And, both sides are trying to keep their key advantages. Their hackers and their incident responders and analysts, you're trying to keep those people doing what they do best as large a percentage of the time as possible. So it helps both sides, but I think clearly is certainly in the medium term a net positive for defenders.